Dauphin is the name of my passion project that I've been working on for almost 3 years now. It's a 2D pixel art RPG where you play as a marine biologist. You can explore and sail between islands, delve into procedurally generated caves, and dive underwater pretty much anywhere you see water. The goal is to discover and save organisms who have been afflicted with a mysterious corruption that's now spreading across the ocean. For these past 3 years, I've been developing Dauphin entirely using the Godot engine, specifically using their in-house scripting language called GDScript, and doing my best to keep the project up to date with whatever the most recent 3.x release has been. With Godot 4 and its third beta as of this recording, I think it's finally time for me to begin the process of converting this project for the new major version. But before I do that, I want to explain why this is the right choice for me and my project. The simplest answer to this question is just that Godot 4 has a lot of features that I'm really excited about and want to use as I continue to build Dauphin. And on top of that, Dauphin's kind of in a place right now where we're not super close to an alpha release or anything like that, so undertaking a big upgrade like this isn't going to jeopardize any releases in the immediate future. I do think it's worth seriously considering whether an upgrade like this is the right choice for your project before jumping into what will likely be a pretty lengthy process to complete the conversion. Even when the beta phase of Godot 4 is over, I assume there will still likely be serious bugs that need addressing, which make it, in my opinion, not a great choice for a game that's nearing a release. In my case, the decision is made, so we are almost ready to jump in and start this conversion. For some background, I have not attempted this previously. I don't know what the issues are that we'll be running into, but we will be encountering those and solving them together one by one. So this will be kind of a different format than my usual devlogs. At the end, when I'm editing this video, I will try to identify all the individual problems we've solved and create chapters down in the YouTube scrubber down there. So if you're having a similar problem with your conversion, maybe you'll be able to jump through and find something relevant to you. If you do get something from this video or enjoy what I assume is going to be a much more code-heavy format today, let me know with a like. I'm always happy to do more of that on the channel. And I'd honestly be very interested to hear in the comments what the most interesting problem you faced with this conversion is if you've done it for your own project. Alright, so I think we'll start all the way from scratch here by actually downloading the most recent beta of Godot 4 from the GodotEngine.org website. So once you head there, you can scroll down to the news feed here where they've been posting about these betas, and we'll click on the most recent one, Godot 4 Beta 3. Once we're in there, we will jump to the downloads section. And in my case, because I'm developing Dauphin entirely using GDScript, all I need is the standard build, but I will be back for the .NET 6 build at some point. I'm really excited about the expanded C# support that they've been working on. So for now, the standard build, and once we jump to the download page, I'm developing everything from an M1 Max MacBook Pro, so all I need is the macOS Universal app. With the new beta downloaded and nestled in right next to the current version of Godot that I've been using to develop Dauphin, we are finally ready to open up the project. Now before we open that project, I want to stress how important it is to back up your work at this point before we go any further. The new version of the engine is going to attempt kind of an in-place conversion of a lot of your code and syntax to match the new syntax in the new version. And if you don't have a way to revert those attempted changes, you could be stuck with a very broken project for a very long time, and that would just be heartbreaking. The good news is that there are a ton of great ways to do this. My preferred method, and the one that I completely recommend, is the use of source control. Now, I'm not going to go too in-depth about source control here because that's not the point of this video, but the long and short of it is that I can use source control to create a new branch that will be an entirely new sandbox apart from my current working code where I can make incremental progress on this conversion. So for me, that will look like a quick command to create a new branch using git checkout -b. Then I just need a name for the branch. So I'll probably do something like upgrade Godot 4. So with our work backed up and the new version of the engine up and running, it's finally time to import Dauphin and get to work on the conversion. I have not imported this yet, so we will go ahead and do that by clicking the import button here. And we want to browse to the project file for Dauphin, which is going to be right in here. We will click import and edit, and at this point we're going to get a couple dialog messages. The first of these is going to tell us that this is a Godot 3.x project and we are converting it to Godot 4. There's a couple options to do this. We can only convert the project file that we just opened, basically the configuration file. We can convert the entire project, which seems to be recommended if you're doing kind of a wholesale engine update as we are, or do nothing and go back. In our case, I do want to make Dauphin work entirely on the new engine, so we are going to attempt the full conversion. We'll get another message here telling us that this is a best effort conversion, so we're still going to have some work to do, and a friendly reminder to back up our project, but we're good to go, so we're going to send it. So I've just double clicked my project in the project manager, and after just a few seconds, the engine appeared here, and this is the very first thing I see. Some dependency issues loading my main title scene. When I click fix dependencies, it kind of looks like everything is in the right spot. So I'm just going to click OK, try to find that window again and hit open anyway. And it looks like we've switched to the 2D view, and this does indeed look like my title scene. So that might actually be a pretty good start. Looking down at the bottom of the editor here, I see we have the dreaded red circle next to the output tab, which is telling me, unsurprisingly, that we have at least one error. And when I open that up, we have far more than one error. It looks like we have a couple warnings, a couple debug messages, and approximately 364 errors that we'll have to fix before this will run. So we have a couple options at this point. I think we could go through that big list of errors kind of top to bottom and try to resolve those as we go along. Or what I'm more inclined to do is just try to run the game. And at that point, the compiler will encounter its first error, and we start from there and basically repeat that process, continue trying to rerun the game until at some point, hopefully, we resolve all the errors and it actually works. So with that being said, let's just run the game and see what we encounter right off the bat. All right, we made it to my transition canvas class, and unsurprisingly, the first error we run into has to deal with Tweens, which changed significantly from 3.x to 4.0, so let's take a look at that. In their previous state, Tweens were just nodes that you would instance up here in the scene tree, and I would follow a pretty common pattern to grab a reference to it using the onReady modifier here, and then once I had the reference to the tween, in multiple places throughout the file, I would use it to call interpolate property to interpolate a property of an object, and then call start to begin the tween. Pretty simple. Looking at the latest version of the docs, we can see how things have changed in Godot 4. Instead of instancing these tweens as nodes in the tree up in the left side of the editor, we can now call the function createTween either on the scene tree or on a given node, and that will create the tween using code instead of just in the editor. Once we have a reference to our tween, instead of calling interpolate property, we now call tween property, and this has a reduced number of arguments here. It looks like we have the object that we want to tween, the property specifically that we want to change, the final variant of that property that we're tweening towards, and the duration of the tween. So back in my code, we can walk through together what this conversion might look like in this particular file. The first thing we want to do is remove the tween that we instanced up here in the tree. We no longer need that, so we will get rid of that guy. And I will keep my onReady tween here, but instead of using the reference to the tree, I will just call the createTween function that we now have on the node, which this canvas layer extends. So now we have a new reference to the new tween, so that works great. What we now have to fix is the call to interpolate property. This is now going to be tween property, and we still want to keep the object that we want to tween, the property of that object. We don't need the starting variant anymore, we just want the final variant. And I no longer really need to specify the easing here as the final two parameters. So just by modifying the signature there, we should be good to go on this particular call of this tween. With both of these calls updated, the final cleanup is going to be to remove those return values that I definitely never use, so that'll be nice to not have to see those anymore, and then also remove the call to start. So we can see once we get rid of all that, how much cleaner the syntax is to work with tweens in Godot 4. So this file should be mostly done at this point, but if I search my project for interpolate property, we can see that I have 44 matches in 17 files. So I will have a little bit of work to go through and basically do what I just did in this file in 17 other places throughout my game. So we will catch up once I've made those changes. All right, I've got the tween conversions wrapped up. I basically did the exact same thing that we did here in my transition canvas class across all the rest of the files in which I use tweens. There was one slight difference, and that is with how I was handling the all completed signal that I was previously connected to for certain tweens. Instead of actually connecting to a signal now, what I'm doing is using the pattern of adding the await keyword at the beginning of this line where I call tween property, and then specifying that we are awaiting the finished signal from that tween all on the same line. This is super nice because it allows us to kind of more easily visualize the control flow of the program when we are awaiting this all on one line instead of potentially connecting to a callback for that signal in a function elsewhere in our file. With tween conversion wrapped up, we are ready to run the program again and see what our next set of errors is going to look like. So I will do that right now and see where we land. And this looks to be my global signals file where we have kind of a list of global signals in an Autoload singleton that can be called and subscribed to by any other scenes. In this case, it looks like my function skillXPRewarded has the same name as the previously declared signal, which is of course right above it. I don't think this is something, or rather a name, that the conversion from Godot 3.x to 4 changed. Maybe this is something that just wasn't caught before, so I will take a look into this. Interestingly enough, it looks like this error was caused by me breaking my own pattern that I was trying to establish in this file. If we look at all the other signals that I have defined here, we have the signal defined, a constant for the string associated with the signal, and then a helper function to call the signal that's always prefixed with signal and an underscore. That is not the case with skillXPRewarded here, which makes me wonder, am I actually calling this function anywhere or calling it correctly? So I've just searched for the skillXPRewarded keyword here and landed in my organism class where sure enough, it turns out I'm actually not using my helper functions for multiple instances of my global signals. That's the case up here for organism cleansed and the case right here for skillXPRewarded. I should be using my helper functions instead of calling emit signal on global signals itself. So I think the fix here is going to be to refactor that helper function and make sure I'm actually using it in the correct places. Sure enough, I was able to update the signature of this function here and that first error went away, and then I followed that up with a quick search for global signals.emit signal. This is something I would ideally never want to call because I've already created these helper functions to do that for me. And then I made sure that I cleaned all those up using the helper functions instead of the direct calls to emit signal. So what's next? We will go ahead and run the app again and see where we land. And this time it looks like we are inside one of my kind of dialog management classes and telling me the identifier file is not declared in the current scope. But I see also below that we have a parser error that we could not load dialog interface, which I suppose is what this arrow is pointing to up here at the top of the file. Looking through my dialog interface class, I'm kind of surprised to see that there are no indications of any errors in here, so I'm not entirely sure why this wouldn't be loading. That said, we do have some errors down here in the debugger. I'm not totally sure that this is related, but we are failing to open a completely different script from a path that I know is definitely not a path that I defined in the project. I certainly have used the keyword world in my file structure, but not world 3D. I assume this is the conversion process trying to convert the word world, which was probably a Godot namespace, into the new world 3D. So it made these changes unintentionally on my behalf. So maybe if I correct these, it will fix maybe some downstream loading of other files like dialog interface. I'm not totally sure, but it should be an easy fix, so I'm going to do that. So quick project search has confirmed this. Every time I had the word world in a path, it has now been changed to world 3D. And if we look, for example, over here in my file explorer, that folder is just called world. So that's why none of this stuff is loading. I hope this makes a difference. Well, the good news is that those paths were easy to correct in the code. The bad news is, unfortunately, it did not change anything about the error we're getting, but I did learn something more. Looking down here at the output again, my scenemanager.gd is still not being loaded. It still thinks it's at this world 3D path. Thing is, this is an autoload singleton. So if I go into my project settings and look at my list of autoloads, one, this path looks correct. So I'm thinking maybe if I just delete this and add it back, it might fix the path issue that the code's trying to use. But apart from that, I also noticed that a couple of other classes, among them my dialog manager that's having an issue, is linked with a path to the script rather than the scene itself, which is interesting. I don't think I would have done that on purpose. So I'm kind of wondering if making sure I'm always linking to the scene here instead of just the script will make a difference in some of these other random errors I'm seeing. Okay, so really interesting. I have just reforged the connection to Scene Manager and Dialog Manager, both linking to the scenes rather than the scripts. And when I close this and now run the game, we land on an entirely different error, no longer anything to do with Dialog Manager. So that seems to have fixed it. A bit of luck on my part to discover that, but interesting that I guess it's really not advisable to link a script in the Autoload singletons. Probably something I should dig a little more into. In any case, we have a new error to debug, so we'll go ahead and jump into this one. It looks like my player stat manager class is not loading. So maybe we'll jump into there where there are plenty more errors. Maybe the top one here, player body, is not loading. Jump in there. Player body part is not loading. So we'll jump into there. And it looks like equipment item might be the issue now that we've drilled all the way down here. Command click is doing nothing for me there. So we'll jump into equipment item script. And this looks like it might be the underlying error to everything we just jumped through. An issue with JSON serialization when it comes time for me to save and load player data from disk. So this is a bit of an interesting case here. If you're familiar with saving and loading in Godot, you might be wondering why I'm attempting manual JSON serialization instead of just using the built-in resource saver class. And that's a very good question. Refactoring Dauphin's saving and loading system to more correctly use internal tooling within the engine, like the resource saver node, is something that's very high on my list of tech debt, as well as things that I'm not super excited about doing. My first inclination when I saw this error was that this might be the perfect time to actually finally tackle that refactor. Unfortunately, we are still very far away from having Dauphin in a state where it actually runs in Godot 4, so there would be no way for me to test if new save files were being created or loaded correctly. So unfortunately, that's not an option right now. For now, unfortunately, I think the play is going to be to go ahead and patch up my kind of questionable implementation using JSON here, which I don't think should be too difficult. If we actually jump into the documentation for the parse call here by command clicking it, you can kind of see what's going on here. The return value is an error. So I think what the converted code here is trying to do is make sure that we have a successful result from trying to parse this JSON string. Because this code is just temporary, I don't actually think I care enough to double check to see that that result is right, because I'm going to be wiping out this code in the future anyway. The quickest but perhaps more dangerous way to simplify this code here is just to call the static function parseString on JSON here and pass in my JSON string. If the parsing fails, this will just return null, but for now I'm expecting success. So we can parse that successfully into my save dictionary, and my kind of janky save system can continue to operate as expected. So I've updated those calls to parseString in about 20 different files that all interact with the save system, and for now I'm happy with that. We're going to turn a blind eye temporarily to the other issues that the save system has, and just go back and run the game again and tackle some more issues. At this point, it looks like we are back in my player stat manager file, but this time we're having trouble loading item bar. So we'll command click into this, and it looks like we are redefining a variable called hidden that's now defined in the parent control class. With a very common identifier like hidden, I can't say I'm too surprised this has happened. While I could maybe try to make use of the new superclass's hidden variable in order just to preserve whatever logic I'm using this flag for in this class, I think the path of least resistance is just going to be to rename this to avoid the collision here with the superclass variable. So I'll rename that to isHidden and then replace all the references to hidden further down in the file. After running the code again, we have jumped 2 lines down from item bar to fishing rod tool item. So we'll go ahead and open that up. And we see we are having some issues with export variables here, specifically dealing with enums. Now, enums have gone through a few changes in Godot 4, and I use enums all the place in my code, so I'm pretty excited about this. Previously, to export an enum and be able to kind of choose the value from the inspector pane over here, I'm quite certain that you had to do @export and then put in parentheses the type of the enum, and then actually define that variable as an int, because that was the underlying type of the enum. I think things have changed for the better here, where we can actually just use the enum as a type in the declaration, and I think that's what the conversion tool has tried to do for me. The only problem is it has kept my old declaration of the int type here. So I think if I just remove this and now use the enum names as their type, these errors will go away. Next up, it looks like we are thrown back into some saving code here in my inventory class. In this particular case, it looks like I'm trying to create a dictionary that represents the state of the inventory and use the index in the inventory as the key here. The problem is the string class no longer has a constructor that takes an integer as an argument. Instead, I think we have a built-in function here called stir, which will try to create a string from whatever variant you pass in as best as it can, and that's what we want to use here. Alright, I think we're overdue for some kind of quick intermission here. It is now Wednesday morning. I started the conversion on Monday, so we're basically 2 full days into the process at this point. After doing just a very quick edit of what I have so far, we're already at 20 minutes, so who knows how long this video is going to be. If you've made it this far, thanks for sticking with me, and as a reward, here's some adorable footage of Moose who just turned 9 months old. Jumping right back in this morning, we are just going to run the project again and see what our next error is. And at this point, it looks like we are in my skill script, and we have an invalid operands error, float and variant being used for the assignment operator. Now, I think floor here is what's producing the variant. If we command click into the documentation here, and down here for better type safety, we can use floor F. So since we are expecting a float as the outcome here, I think we could just append the character F to the end of the floor function name here to call floor F, and that wraps up our issue. So this is kind of cool. After wrapping up those errors and running the game again, we finally land in the player class, which means we must be getting far enough along in game initialization that the player is trying to load. Now this is a very big and complex class, as you can imagine, with a lot of dependencies. So we'll just start at the very top here with the player's corruption component. So if I command click in, a couple issues in here. Right off the bat, we are having trouble preloading these two files, and this honestly looks very similar to what happened with World and World 3D. I probably used a name that I shouldn't have in my folder hierarchy, and Godot has tried to convert that. So since we've seen this error before, I'm just going to go through here and clean up maybe anything we've already talked about and catch up when we have something new to look at. After a little bit of cleanup, it turns out we make it all the way through all of our kind of dependency stuff up here down to our local variables, where it's telling me I am redefining my variable velocity in the native class character body 2D. And this was kind of surprising. I didn't actually realize that my player's class type had been changed from kinematic body 2D to character body 2D, which I suppose is new in Godot 4. So when I click into here, I kind of browsed through the documentation and saw that indeed velocity was already defined. And I think this is a great change. I basically always had to define a custom velocity variable in my character classes for use throughout all my different movement states. So this is pretty cool to see. Alright, after removing that custom velocity variable and rerunning the game, we now land in my player state machine, specifically in the big match statement that looks at the requested state to determine what state to switch to. Previously, I was switching over just all the references to the states up here at the top of the file. It looks like in Godot 4, expressions and match patterns must be constants, and I kind of think this is a good change. It did feel sort of like the Wild West out here, switching between a potentially kind of random assortment of variables. So I think the fix for this is going to be to turn this match into a bunch of ifs so that I don't have to create kind of a duplicate enumeration of all these states. So here's what this looks like fixed up. I have to say I'm not a huge fan of the way this looks with all the ors and comparisons here. It is still pretty easy to see what's going on with state selection, but the match was a lot nicer looking. So I think what I'll maybe end up doing is revisiting this to see if there's a better way to compare states, but for now, this should work. Next up, we are back in my corruption component where it looks like I'm trying to check if a node path is not empty by comparing it to an empty string here, which the compiler no longer likes. I think the best way to do this is now to call the isEmpty function on that node path, and of course negate that for this particular case. After rerunning again, we find ourselves in my day-night cycle canvas modulate class, which I created with the help of a BitBrain video, so thanks Miguel. We are having an issue here with os.getTime, which would return a dictionary with hours, minutes, and seconds that I use for some of my day-night time calculations. This was deprecated in Godot 4, so the new method here is to use the time singleton and a function called getTimeDict from system that returns that same type of dictionary. Another quick one here in my player foot class, which is used to do things like show particles when the player dashes and footprints when the player's feet strike the ground. Looks like I'm using a reference to the Node2D global rotation degrees here, which I don't think is a thing anymore in Godot 4. I think we have to work with global rotation in radians. I don't actually have to do a conversion here since I'm setting this to 0, but if I did, there is a helper for that, degrees to radians, and you can pass in your degrees there and you should be all set. Another interesting one here in my save file class. If we look at the error, it tells us we cannot find the property plus file on base string. And it looks like plus file was a function I was calling to concatenate the parts of my file name, specifically the user prefix and then the actual name of the file itself. That is no longer a function, and I assume what this function did do was try to maybe be smart about how forward slashes were managed in this string. For now, I could not find a replacement for this, so I'm going to kind of fly blind here and just use a plus to concatenate these strings. After fixing that, I am once again met with this error that the identifier file is not declared in the current scope. I did even more digging than I did the first time, and I realized that this indeed did change with Godot 4. Rather than file, this is now FileAccess. I don't know why it took me so long to figure that out. I will have to change this in quite a few places, so I'll knock that out and hopefully clear up a bunch of these errors. Apart from just the name change, it seems that a little bit of the usage of the file system has changed as well. You can see that I now have an error with the FileExist call on the instance of the FileAccess that I've just tried to create here. If we command clicked into FileAccess and look at the documentation, I can see that some functions that once used to be instance methods are now static. For example, the open function here being called on the FileAccess class. And then if we scroll down here, the particular function in question, FileExist, is also static. So I'm gonna have to make a few updates where I am calling these particular functions. After cleaning up those FileAccess calls and running the game again, I find myself back in my corruption component, and this time I'm told that my corruption particles are null, which is interesting because those should just be up in the tree. I'm grabbing a reference to those right here. Unfortunately, it appears that my corruption node has been totally deleted from the tree here, and we can see that there's some funky stuff going on with what I suppose was an attempt by the conversion tool to help me figure this out. Instead of corruption particles, it's changed this to GPUParticles3D, and I think somewhere along the line this node just got completely deleted, so I will have to restore that. Thankfully, that was pretty easy to wrap up. I just added a GPUParticles2D node here in the scene, renamed it to be corruption particles, and made sure that my onReady reference was set correctly here, and now that error is gone. While I'm in the corruption file, I happened to notice these to-do converter 40 comments that were put in here for me during the conversion of something that I was actually really excited to see changed from Godot 3 to Godot 4. That particular piece of functionality revolved around a keyword called setGet, which, as it kind of sounds, was the tool used to create setters and getters for variables. We're looking at the stable version of the 3.x documentation here, and you can see how setGets used to work. Basically, you declare your variable, follow it by the setGet keyword, and then pass in the name of your setter function and your getter function. This code block right here is a pretty good example of how all that comes together with your declaration and your two functions. Where this really got kind of funky in my mind was where you only had setter or getter functions in the example below that. You'd kind of have to have an empty value here for the setter and then just a comma and the getter. Overall, I was not a big fan of this syntax, and it's not something I used a whole lot in my project for that reason. Thankfully, in Godot 4, this has all changed for the better. Here in my corruption file, I used setGet in two places, for my corruption state and my current corruption, and you can see how the conversion tool has done a great job of converting things to the new syntax. The setGet keyword is gone, and we now have a colon after our variable declaration and two kind of indented child functions here, get and set, which make way more sense. In both of these cases, I didn't actually have a getter defined, so you can see it tells me there was no get function to convert here. And for my setter, it actually finds the name of the function that I had used previously with setGet and tells me, hey, in order to fix this up, you need to copy the content of that function here to the new set function. I know I have a handful of these to work throughout my code base, so I think I'm just going to go heads down and try to knock that out and probably end up taking a break at this point since we have been on the grind on these errors today. We will catch up soon to hopefully get this thing running. Welcome back, y'all. It is now Saturday afternoon. Over the past 2 or so days, I have continued to work through really just different instances of the same errors we have already chatted about, and at this point, I have some pretty cool news to share. After resolving many more instances of the errors that we've been talking about over the past, however long the video is at this point, we are finally at the stage where Dauphin runs. And when I say runs, I don't mean that we are done with the conversion process. Instead, the game runs continuously without being halted by errors. And as it turns out, that's quite a big difference from us being done with the conversion process. I'll show you what I'm talking about. So the moment of truth, this is what I see when I run Dauphin. The good news about this is that we don't have any errors down here in the console. The not as good news is what we see here in the game window. I'll go ahead and expand that. And really there's probably quite a few things to unpack here, and even more that I'll learn once I start diving in here to these issues. But I want to call out a few glaring issues first that'll be the focus of my attention. Right off the bat, we definitely have a few systems that are working, mainly the corruption from what it looks like here. We still have corruption pools spawning below corrupted entities. The corruption shader seems to be working, as well as the particles, and I do see our sand crabs walking around in their wander state spreading corruption, so that's all good news. As far as what's broken, there's probably more than what I can identify just from looking at our island scene here, but of course the tile maps need to be, I think, totally recreated from scratch with new tile sets in order to kind of visualize the actual island itself. Once the tile map is recreated, I think the camera will start to work again and actually zoom in on the player, because the camera is dependent upon the bounds of the tile map. So I suspect that's why we are pretty zoomed out here. On top of that, if I hit WASD or escape or tab to bring up any UI, none of that is working. So I have no idea what happened to my input maps. I will definitely have to check that out. And of course, speaking of UI, we can see that the main game UI is kind of zoomed out and all over the place here. One thing I did notice is if I scroll the mouse, the little item bar down here at the bottom still scrolls. So hey, that's something. I think the play for me here is going to be to dive into the new tile maps, and specifically the new tile map documentation, to figure out how this all works. Once I have the tile map set back up and it looks like the player's on an island again, it'll be a much nicer foundation to start tackling other issues. And like I said, hopefully the camera will start to work again too. So I'm going to dive heads down on that now. We'll see how it goes. Hey everyone, I'm joining you again a few days later on the following Monday. Just wrapped up a couple days of travel for family stuff, and unfortunately I'm going to be traveling again tomorrow for work, but we have a brief opportunity now to show you the progress I've been making cleaning up our main scene here in Dauphin. So this is the current state of Dauphin. Clearly still a lot of work to be done, but there have been some massive improvements since the last update. You can see once again that we can now traverse the beach. Our tile set is back to mostly normal. You can see we have animated ocean water here as we did before. And we've actually started to introduce some of Dauphin's organisms back to the scene as well. You can see we have palm trees with various levels of corruption, and somewhere there should be sand crabs wandering around, although they don't quite animate correctly when they're chasing the player, and unfortunately the notion of spreading corruption is not working. I want to quickly walk you through some of the changes I had to make to get us from our previous update to this new current state, and that really all focuses around the creation of this brand new island scene. I'll go into depth on this in a minute, but the reason my previous scene wasn't working was because my old beach tile set became invalidated. Once I created the new tile set, I figured I could just create a new island since we've been looking at the same one in all the devlogs for so long. I know this one doesn't look too different yet, but I'm hoping to get more creative once I get everything sorted out. The reason that my previous tile set broke with the update is that there is a new way to create animated tile sets in Godot 4. Animated tile sets are how I create the effect of the water washing up and down the beach here. Rather than create an animated texture and use that as the source for the tile set, we instead export the main texture for our tile set as essentially a sprite sheet, and then here in the tile set editor I can define animations for individual tiles. You can kind of see that if I hover my mouse over one of the columns here on the right. You can see the tile on the left over here that it's corresponding to is highlighted. I actually created an entire tutorial for this because this was a little hard for me to figure out how to do, and I'll leave one of those links up in the top corner and in the description. After building my new tile set and recreating my basic beach scene, I realized I had a few project settings that I needed to tweak to get things looking a little bit better. The first of these was within the window settings of the display dropdown in the General tab. My viewport width and height for some reason had reverted to 1080p when in reality Dauphin's intended render resolution is 320 by 180. So fixing this fixed kind of the zoom issue with the game, now looks much better and the UI elements are the correct size again. While I was in the project settings, I figured I'd take a look at the input map since I was not able to move the player anymore. For some reason, all of my inputs that corresponded to keyboard keys like WASD had been basically just deleted. So I had to reset these, and once I did, I had movement back for the player. So I'm glad that was a really quick fix. At some point along the way, I also noticed that my Y-sort functionality was broken, so the player could no longer walk in front of or behind trees or, other things like being covered up by his own footsteps here. Turns out this is an easy fix and a great enhancement in the new version of Godot. If I go to my island scene here, you'll see that I no longer have an actual node that is a Y-sort node. Those have completely gone away in Godot 4. Instead, all node 2Ds have a new property called Y-sort enabled. When you toggle this on, all of the children will kind of have the same functionality as if they were the child of one of those previous Y-sort nodes. So you saw I just clicked this on over here on my main scene, and when I rerun the game, all of my Y-sort stuff will be working as intended. This is a lot of great progress since the last update, but unfortunately the task that remains is one of the ones I'm dreading the most, which is fixing up my control nodes. You can see I have UI strewn all about the place here, an interact button that does not go away. The item bar icons here are too close together, and when I press tab to open up what was once my beautiful field notes, we have just a horrible, horrible mess. I'd love to think that I just have to update some settings within my existing control nodes, but something tells me that is not the case. I am going to once again go heads down and try to knock this stuff out, and will hopefully be caught up in a few days with some much nicer looking UI. Hey everyone, joining you again on a rainy Sunday afternoon after quite a hiatus from filming. It's been another week and a half of just constant travel for me for work and holiday and family stuff, but it's all been a lot of fun. And the good news is that even though I haven't filmed too much, I have made a ton of progress on the conversion. I'm excited to get you all caught up. We'll go ahead and jump right into the current state of the game here. You might recall from when we last left off that I was having a ton of issues with the display of pretty much every UI element that I had previously designed. Hopefully you can tell now from the heads up display at least that I've been able to resolve most of that. We've got the resource bars up here stacked correctly and working again with the sprinting system, which is nice. And we have our item bar containing items that we can scroll through, and our dive watch up here where you can change through the faces just as you were able to before. The really good news here is that when I press tab to open up my field notes, we no longer have a giant mess up here in the top left corner. Turns out I had some pretty serious kind of anchor related layout issues that I was able to resolve very quickly and get this laid back out just as it was before. And I'm really happy that it's looking good again, because that was a huge mess that I was worried about sorting through. On top of that, I'm also able to still move items in different slots in the inventory and save the inventory and load it from disk. Really glad I didn't have to fix too much there. Once I had some of that UI cleaned up, I decided to change gears and start looking at the basics of gameplay since I was having trouble swinging the coral wand. I'm happy to say I've been able to resolve that now, so we can swing the wand as normal, and it can remove corruption from corrupted organisms, and we can also do our cast attack by right-clicking. I'm going to show you a few of the issues I ran into when fixing this up. I'm going to show you these couple of simple issues on my jellyfish organism because this is a class that I have not had a chance to go through and fix up yet. You might already be able to notice the first of these issues, and that is that all the collision shapes of my various nodes that are children of my parent character class here were reset to be super tiny. So a lot of my issues that I was facing out of the box had to deal with collisions not happening as they were supposed to. And that's because all these shapes got reset, which was super annoying. So I've been going back through each of these organisms and fixing up the collision shapes. The next issue, which I realize now my jellyfish does not have, is still present in a handful of animations for my player. If we look down here at the right hand slot, you'll notice that we have a rotation key. This was previously rotation degrees, but rotation degrees has been removed as a property from nodes. The engine did not update the name of this keyframe for me, so I had to go through and change all of these to be rotation instead of rotation degrees. And I also noticed that the conversion tried to update the rotation value of this keyframe up here in the inspector. You can see it did not do a very good job. I'm not quite sure what this was before, but I know it didn't correspond to negative 3,400 degrees. So I've had to go through and update basically every single keyframe where I've had a rotation. It's really motivating actually to be back on the beach performing the basic gameplay loop of removing corruption from organisms and picking up their loot, but I did make one further improvement here, and that's when we wade out into the deep water and used the dive flag. I was able to restore my kind of transition effect here, which still needs a little bit of work, and actually transition to the underwater scene, which is still procedurally generated. You can see we still have quite a few issues here, again revolving around rotation of the organisms and apparently the dive watch up here, but it's great that I was able to load into this scene. I'm really excited about that. So at this point, work is going to continue on the underwater scene. I do feel like I'm hitting a bit of a groove here, recognizing the same issues over and over and being able to resolve them more quickly, which is definitely increasing my velocity here. Starting to see a light at the end of the tunnel as we introduce more gameplay functionality back to Dauphin, so I'm excited for the next update. Good morning, y'all. We have made it to the following Saturday, and over the past week, I've made a ton of progress on the underwater scene, as well as with a handful of other gameplay mechanics that I've been able to restore, and I'm really excited to show you the progress and talk about the path forward from here. So we'll start out real quick just by checking out the underwater scene. So I'll wade out to deep water, deploy my dive flag from the item bar, and that'll start the transition to the procedurally generated underwater scene. Once we're there, we'll see that it looks a lot clearer because we can now equip the snorkel mask. And when we dive down, we'll see that everything was pretty much working as it was before. We still get a warning once we hit the limit based on our diving level. And once we are kind of at the seafloor, you can see that all of our organisms are behaving as expected. Corruption is spreading, and our jellyfish are still swimming around and totally capable of attacking the player. Back on the surface here, I have some good news to share about the fishing system, which we have not chatted about yet. As I was working on the inventory system and getting equipment selection working again, I realized I had been neglecting a whole separate inventory, which is the player's tackle box. Now we can again open the tackle box and see if we have any fishing equipment in there. And more importantly, if we have a fishing pole in our inventory, we can right-click that and pull up the fishing display alongside the tackle box as we had before, so we can modify various parts of our fishing setup. Once I had the fishing pole set up, I'm very glad to say I did not have to make any changes to my casting code. Everything there works just as it did before, which was a big relief. So over the past month, as I've been working on this conversion and filming these video clips and working on the video that you're watching now, I've kind of come to the point where I think we're basically 90% done with the conversion and 40 minutes into a giant video. Now, when you hear 90%, that might seem a little bit high at first. If you've been following the devlog series from the very beginning, you'll know that there are a few big features we haven't even touched on yet. The first of those is procedural generation of the caves that the player can find on the island and explore, and the other big one is the ability of the player to enter their research vessel on the shore of an island and sail on a procedurally generated ocean to find other islands. These are two features that I'm actually not planning on including in this conversion effort, and that is for a few different reasons. First off, all of the procedural generation for the cave relied heavily on the API for the TileMap and TileSets back as they were in version 3.x. In version 4, as we already talked about, TileMaps and TileSets are very different, and I think it would be honestly easier to kind of redesign that procedural generation system in a way that I like a bit more than trying to adapt my old system to the new APIs. As for the sailing mechanic, I think there's a lot we could chat about here, but to be totally honest, the reason I'm not going to put effort into converting it at this point is because I don't think it's a very compelling feature. That's some of the first feedback I got from y'all when I first introduced it in a devlog, and after having the chance to kind of play test it myself for a little while, it always feels like a chore to kind of do that loading into the procedural ocean and slowly move the boat over to a new island. So I think I just need to revisit the actual gameplay mechanic there rather than try to spend time converting what I have. So with all that said, what is actually left to do for this conversion effort? As far as I can tell, the only things that I need to add back to the island scene are the fisherman's hut that you can enter and speak with the fisherman NPC, as well as the player's docked research vessel that they should be able to enter from the beach and then enter their cabin. I'm hoping both of those tasks will be relatively frictionless, so I'm going to jump in now and hopefully join y'all for the very last update of this monster video. Alright y'all, after pretty much an entire month's worth of effort working on this engine upgrade and nothing else, it's time for the most exciting part, and that is the final update of this video. I'm happy to report that those last few development tasks were not very stressful at all. I've got the research vessel back on the shore and the fisherman's hut somewhere back on the island, and with those two things working, I pretty much have all the individual building blocks required to build an island complete. So that's what I did. I started over from scratch for this initial kind of test island that we've been playing on and built it back bigger than ever before. So here's our new aptly named tutorial island in the editor. It's not particularly huge because this is kind of a testing playground for me and I don't want it to be too annoying to add and find new things in here. But you can see I was able to get a bit more creative with the shape here and kind of create these parts sticking out. Overall, very happy that my tile set was able to accommodate this, and as always, happy with the TileMap system and how quickly I was able to spin this up. In-game, I am thrilled to see so many things working again, especially after the initial part of the conversion where nothing worked. There's obviously still going to be some stuff that needs fixing, like the fading on the ground corruption and the footprints I can already see, but we have restored so much functionality and now have such a strong foundation to continue building this game with Godot 4. This past month has definitely been one of, if not the biggest challenges I've had to face so far with Dauphin's development. On one hand, we have spent basically an entire month not making any forward feature progress, which is kind of tough to stomach when you think about how long the project's been in flight already and how much more work I feel there is to be done. On the other hand, we've made it to the other side of a monumental effort that I wasn't even sure was going to be totally possible, and now I'm honestly very excited to continue working on Dauphin with this brand new feature set and updates to GDScript and everything that Godot 4 has to offer. With all that said, I think it's finally time to wrap up this massive video. As always, I want to give a special shout out and a thank you to my Patreon supporters, especially those of y'all who've stuck with me over the past month as I've had very little time to produce special content on Patreon. Grammy supporters this month have been Mega Ombre, Samuel SVD, Jess Sargo, and Sergeant Bobby Bobowitz, and beta supporters have been Cody Odin, Vlad Sunny, Deluse, Happy Hippie, and Universal Codex. Thank y'all so much for sticking with me on this one. I hope you'll stay tuned as I am super excited to get back to my normal, shorter devlog format and start building out new functionality for Dauphin again. I'll see you soon.